With this most recent festive event, Wargaming has introduced a bunch of national and universal fragments into the ecosystem, which you can just get pretty much for free by getting the festive atmosphere up to level 10. I would highly recommend doing this because these these fragments are incredibly useful to allow you to skip past tanks that are bad, and that's going to be the focus of today's video. I'm going to try and keep this brief because my previous recordings of this were over 25 minutes long, and I want to try and keep this somewhat quick, so I'm going to try and aim for under 20 minutes if at all possible, because 25 minutes seems a bit excessive because I was going into too much detail on like why I didn't like certain vehicles and like why I did like others. So I'm going to just focus purely on the vehicles which I think you should skip first. Then any vehicles which I feel like I have neglected to mention, I will go back to after I've gone through the initial tanks. So I'm going to start off with the Italians and recommend you keep all of your national fragments for now, because Wargaming has announced an Italian heavy tank line. We have no details in regards to it, but there's probably going to be some stinkers in that line, and right now the Italian medium tank line doesn't really have any downright bad tanks above tier 5 at least. Like, when it comes to lower tiered vehicles, it's not really worth skipping past those because they're so, like, there's such a short period that you play them for, there's not really much purpose in skipping them. So I would say keep all your national fragments for the Italians, at least for now, to see what happens with the Italian heavy tank line. So next up is the Swedish. The tank I skipped past was the Leo, because I didn't want to grind out another Emil 1 on the Leo because I hated the Leo grinding out the Emil 1. So I skipped the Leo's grind to get the UDS 14.5. I used a bunch of national fragments to actually get this thing, because I used I think I used about 30 national fragments to actually get the UDS 14.5 because I just did not feel like playing the Leo again. I also remember not liking the IKV 90B, but I think it was mainly because I was playing it kinda too aggressively. But at the same time, I feel like I may have been playing it aggressively because I didn't like the dispersion on the tank and found the tank was just horrifically inaccurate. So I figured I would just go to close range instead of hoping for the best at long range. The Polish line, it's not even a question. Skip the 40 TP because the 40 TP is a big, slow, poorly armored medium tank with an awful gun. So it's just an awful tank in every shape of the word. So skip this thing here if you possibly can, because this tank is just not worth playing. It really isn't. There's very few tanks in the game which I would recommend not playing at all. This is one of them because it was horrific. For Czechslovakia, I would recommend skipping the TVP VTU. It's basically like a Panther 2 but with worse armor, worse penetration on its gun, and just worse handling overall as far as I can tell. Like, I think it has a better part of weight ratio, but its side armor is only 40mm, which means it's easily penetrated by 122mm guns. It's just overmatched and just gets wrecked. So I wouldn't recommend playing this tank. I would have a very hard time recommending playing this thing because it's just a pain to play. I don't understand why this thing doesn't have an autoloader like the Skoda T50. Personally, I think it should. For the Japanese, I would potentially recommend skipping the Oni because the Oni's weakness is such a dumb weakness, and it's one that will really piss you off whenever you find out about it. The obvious place which everyone shoots on a tank whenever they're trying to outflank it is the front drive wheel. Guess where the weakness is on the Oni? Behind the front drive wheel. This tank here I found to be incredibly frustrating and just hated playing it every single moment that I did. The OHO is a similar kind of case, but I didn't think it was quite as bad tier for tier as the Oni. In fact, there were some games where I actually had quite a lot of fun in the OHO using the 150mm gun that it has. You may also want to skip the Chi-Ri. Personally, I'm not doing that just yet because I haven't decided my full opinion on the Chi-Ri yet, because the Chi-Ri, I have seen a lot of people do really well in it. So I'm going to keep playing it and see how it goes. So I may potentially skip that tank in the future. Next up is China. Now, China is a line which you could skip a lot of vehicles in. So first off, the 110. The 110 might sound like an odd choice, but the 110 has been power crept really, really badly in the game. But one thing I will warn you about if you're skipping the 110. You have to play this tank before you skip it. Do not go to the WZ-111-14 unless you 1. Have enough free XP to just free XP this 100mm gun, or 2. Until you've unlocked the gun by playing this tank normally. You do not want to be playing this WZ-111-14 with 175 penetration on your standard rounds, unless you have all the credits in the world to justify all the gold rounds in the world. That would be one of the worst experiences I could imagine. So definitely get this gun before you move on to the 111-14. Next up is the T-34-2. I personally like this tank, but it hasn't aged very well because back when I played this thing, the M26 Pershing, the Centurion Mark 1 and the T-44 had far weaker turrets than they have now. So this thing's basically specialty was to just brawl enemy tanks and get really close to them and just use your turret just to deflect shots. And it was great at doing that with that 122mm gun. It was so much fun. I genuinely loved this tank whenever I played it because it was small, nimble, and it had a tough turret. These days though, most medium tanks of tier 8 seem to have tough turrets, so it's not really as... It's kind of lost its niche, is probably the best way to describe it. I wouldn't really recommend skipping the WZ-120 because the WZ-120 is... It kind of prepares you for the 121. That's probably the best way to describe it. As for the light tanks, you may want to skip the 132A, but I will admit my expectations of the 132A were kind of inflated because I was hoping it would play like the old tier 8 WZ-132 before it was made like a standard tier 8. It was a tier 8 light tank that was... I'm trying to think of the best way to describe this. So back in the day, top tier light tanks were tier 8. That's what the WZ-132 was whenever I played it. I went on to the WZ-132A hoping it would be like the WZ-132, and it wasn't, and I was massively disappointed. So my expectations may have been too high for this tank. For the tank destroyers, I would probably recommend skipping the WZ-111-1FT because it just doesn't seem like a very good vehicle. It has 180mm of casement armor, it's really flat and unangled. It has 100mm of frontal plate armor and lower front plate armor, which is not very good either. It's a big target and it's slow, and its guns are powerful, but it just doesn't seem like a very good overall package. For the English, there's only really one tank that springs out to me immediately. Skip the Black Prince. Don't really have to go into much detail. It's a slow, heavy tank with a really weak gun, so I would say skip this thing and get on to the good stuff in the form of the Carnarvon. Otherwise, in the English tree, I wouldn't recommend skipping the Challenger anymore because the Challenger is a lot better now because it now has the 32-pounder gun it can use. You may want to skip the AT-7 if you find the gun layout too awkward. Otherwise, the medium tank line, there's nothing really to skip there. Light tank line, I haven't played, so I'm not going to make too many judgments, although I have heard the light tank line in this game is light tank line in the English tree is really, really weak. For the French, this is one of the more awkward ones to describe, because if you're going towards the MX-50B, I would recommend skipping the M445, but only if you have no intention of going for the M454 anytime soon. If you have intentions of going to the M454, I recommend you save your blueprint fragments to go and skip the MX-65T, because the 65T, tier for tier, in my opinion, is a worse tank than the M445 by a long way. So yeah, I would recommend skipping the 65T if you're going to go down the M454 line at some point, and if you've no intention of going down that line, I would recommend skipping the M445. Otherwise, in the tank destroyer line, I would recommend skipping the SC-46 because the SC-46 is a big brick with awful gun handling and really, really narrow gun traverse. It doesn't have an autoloader like the rest of the French tank destroyer line after it, which is kind of why it feels so awkward, because it feels like it's just a boring tank destroyer, but it's more awkward than a boring tank destroyer. So it's just not a vehicle that's very fun to play, and because it's such a big target, artillery loves shooting at it, and it gets spotted really easy as well. I just did not like the tank at all, because you can't even play it aggressively because the armor's not good enough. When it comes to the light tanks and mediums, the only one that potentially you could skip is the EBR Hotchkiss. It's a bit awkward as far as the wheeled vehicles go, because the Lynx 6x6 is where things get good, but I would recommend giving it a try before you skip it. For the Americans, only really 2 or 3 vehicles pop out to me. The M103, because the M103, in my opinion, is one of the weakest tier 9 heavy tanks in the game right now, because the Conqueror just does everything the M103 does, but better. With a far stronger turret and far stronger hull, in my opinion. For the tank destroyers, the T25/2 is a tank that hasn't changed in years, and it wasn't very good years ago. For the mediums, the T69 is a vehicle you may want to skip past, but I would also potentially recommend playing it because it gets you used to the playstyle of the T54A1, because they do have similar playstyles. I will admit I didn't play the full grind in the T69 because I did the grind for the T54A1 on the tier 8 version of the T49. That's the reason I don't really have much experience with the T69. I did grind 50k XP on it with the fully upgraded loadout, but I didn't play it as much as a full grind, if that makes sense. So it might just be my short time playing it that's kind of biasing me towards it a little bit. I don't think it's that bad, but I think it's not the greatest as well. You also might want to skip the T20 prototype. It's nowhere near as bad as it used to be, but I still have a lot of resentment towards this vehicle because this is one of the few vehicles I ever skipped the entire way past, because back when I played it, it had an open turret, which meant artillery one-shot it all the time, and same with KV2s. KV2s could just one-shot you consistently, and it was just so slow because it could only do 18 kilometers an hour. So it was a massive target, really slow with an open turret. It was basically just hell to play. So next up is the Russians. The Russians don't have that many vehicles which I would recommend skipping. The main ones that pop out to me are the KV4 and the 705 in the heavy line, because the 705, personally, I just didn't really like playing it very much, and I thought the 705A was better, but I will probably admit that the 705, if you don't like it, you probably won't like the 705A very much. As for the KV4 is an absolute gold magnet, and well, it's not exactly fun to play that tank in today's meta. It used to be a lot of fun in days gone by, but right now with gold rounds flying everywhere, it's not that much fun to play, and it gets absolutely hammered by even medium tanks nowadays. Because I mean, if you look at the T44's upgraded turret, I keep doing that by accident. T44's upgraded turret has 190 millimeters of armor. How much armor does the KV4 turret have? 200, 220, 180. Yeah, that just gives you an idea of how much power creep has happened in this game over time. As far as the rest of the Russian line, I can't really make too many statements in regards to the tank destroyers, because I wouldn't recommend skipping anything in the 268 line. But the 268 V4 line, I haven't played enough of to really make any serious comments. I'm going to play it by ear pretty much, and say, well, when I say play it by ear, I mean I'm going to play the tanks, see what I think of them. If I hate them, I'll skip them. If I don't hate them, then I'll keep playing them. That's pretty much what I'm going to do when it comes to those vehicles. But I think the one I'm most likely to skip is the SU-101, because its grind seems horrific. As far as mediums go, some people would probably skip the F-43, some people the T-43, but I think both of those vehicles are still playable. They're not absolutely horrific tanks. And light tank wise, the LTG I never played, so I can't make very many comments on that thing. I think that's pretty much everything for the Russian line, so on to the Germans. And the Germans is actually one that's pretty quick to talk about. The Tiger P is a vehicle a lot of people would skip. I would probably recommend skipping one grind on this tank. I wouldn't recommend skipping both grinds to the VK4502A and the VK10001P, because I think you should save some of the national fragments for the Mausien. Because the Mausien, as far as I've heard for the Maus line, is pretty much the weakest link. When it comes to tank destroyers, I would recommend skipping the Sturm Emil, because the Sturm Emil is not a very good tank. It's huge, it's slow, its gun is powerful but has very limited ammo capacity, and it just gets one shot by artilleries. Well, back when I played it, it got one shot by artilleries and got one shot by KV2s on the regular, so I didn't really like playing that tank in any shape or form. When it comes to the mediums and the lights I can't comment on very much because I've never played the SB1C, the HWK12, and I only played the Tier 8 RU251, so I don't have much relevant information on those. But when it comes to the mediums, aren't really any standout vehicles which I would recommend skipping. So the only one that springs to mind is the Leo PTA, and it's not because it's a bad tank. It's because the tank has a long stock grind. And because it has a long stock grind, you may want to potentially skip it. Because, just look at this. You have to grind 20,000 XP for the tracks, 33,000 XP for the engine, so that's about 55,000 XP so far. For the turret, another 24,000 XP, so that's up to, 80,000 XP. Then you have to grind out the tracks, or not tracks, sorry, for some reason I said tracks, I meant to say gun. That's up to 142,000 XP, and then you add the radio on top of that, and that's about 150,000 XP you have to grind out on this tank to get it fully upgraded. And the tank is pretty good as a fully upgraded tank, but considering you can just unlock the gun and then use blueprints to skip to Leopard 1, it might be better to do that, but I'll leave that decision up to you to decide whether or not you want to do that or not. So I think that's pretty much everything as far as my opinions on skippable tanks go, but I would be curious to see what other people think, what you guys think are tanks that you would want to skip would be, because my opinion is maybe a little bit outdated. There might be other vehicles now which are a lot weaker than I remember them being, but put a list of vehicles which you would skip if you could now in the comments section. Also, if you have skipped any vehicles using all free XP, then put those in the comment section as well. Also, I'm limiting this here pretty much to tier 5 and above, because below tier 5, I think most people who played the game for a long time usually skip tiers 2, 3 and 4, because it's not really worth playing very much, because you're not really going to do much with those tanks. There's no gun marks or anything like that, so there's not really much reason to play them very much. So I would say put down in the comment section any tier 5 and above vehicle you've skipped using full free XP or full blueprints. Like for me, I fully skipped the T20 prototype back when it was absolutely awful. Whenever I played it, I skipped this thing completely. I also recently skipped the U.S.A 14.5 because I didn't want to play the Leo again. So let me know what tanks you guys have done this on as well, because I'm very curious to see what type of vehicles that people skip just in general.